Gimli is a high might commander, very similar to Legolas or Aragorn too, but more flexible. He's able to switch between an excellent commander damage dealer, a dwarf and elven army buffer, or a hybrid between the two. In this video, I'll show you how to spec him for amazing commander damage. I hope you enjoy. Gimli is a tier 2 commander whose respect is increased using the torn pages from Mazarbul's tome item, which is also shared by another commander in Balin. The game defines his role as a warrior who leads dwarves and can provide unit buffs. His warrior role will grant him 25 might, 2 skill points, and a massive 10% buff to his commander physical damage when he hits level 20. His main stat is his might, which has a base of 100, which increases by an enormous 2.38 per level. This is balanced, however, by very lackluster focus, with a base of 54 increasing by 0.78 per level, and very poor speed, with 35 only increasing by 0.7 per level. From this, you can therefore see that Gimli is essentially a massive walking tank on the battlefield, slowly moving round, but when he hits hard. His unique item is Balin's Axe, which gives him an additional 22 might from the base item, which can be increased to an enormous 66 might when fully strengthened. In addition to this, it grants additional attack to dwarves in your army, though this is a secondary focus in this build, as we'll be intending to focus on increasing the commander damage rather than army damage. The bonus on this item, Durin's Focus, does exactly that. At 150 might, you gain 2% additional commander damage. You gain an additional 2% again when Gimli reaches 300 might. And when his focus reaches 100, you also gain Pursuit. Both of the damage buffs can be increased to 12% when fully refined, so that totals up to 24% additional commander damage. In my personal opinion, this is probably the best tier 2 unique item in the game. The might bonus alone from the item is, when fully strengthened, is more that can be gained from the Axe of Khazad-dûm, which is the highest might regularly available item in the game. Then on top of that, you can deal to that 24% bonus damage. This makes it miles and away the best item for a physical damage dealer, bar none. And then the absolute icing on the cake is that when his focus reaches 100, you get Pursuit as well. So it makes him very anti-meta against very popular commanders like Gil-galad and Gandalf the Grey, who focus almost primarily on their evasion. So once you factor all of that in, you're left with the best weapon in the game. If you're debating which tier 2 commander to invest in and get their unique item, you definitely cannot make a wrong decision by choosing Gimli. So now into his skills. Some of these will be familiar to anyone who's run Dwalin. His Respect 0 skill tree is headlined by Experienced Warrior, which grants Gimli up to 60% bonus damage, and 10% additional damage to melee units when it's maximised. The first sub-skill of this is Hunt Down, which increases the damage that can be dealt to an enemy unit after being hit by Gimli by 1.6% per skill point. This can also stack up twice, so the enemy will receive more damage as the battle goes on. The second sub-skill is Collaboration, which increases Gimli's normal attack damage by 17.8% per skill point. The second Respect 0 skill tree is designed to buff Gimli's troops, and it begins with Lockbearer. This gives a 30% chance of 2 allied units being healed by up to 50% when damage is sustained. When this is maximised, the HP recovery is then also modified by his focus stat, though as I mentioned earlier, his focus isn't particularly great, so this isn't massively useful. The first sub-skill, Friendly Relations, reduces damage received by any elf or dwarf unit by 2% per skill point. The second sub-skill, Protect Elves, causes your dwarf unit with the highest defense to gain an additional 4.2% defense per skill point and also protect any elf units from damage. The Respect 3 skill tree is Durin's Blood, which increases your commander's skill damage by 2.3% per skill point, and also further increases Gimli's might by 15 points when maximised. The first sub-skill, Whirlwind, deals up to 300% damage to 2 enemy targets every 3 rounds, prioritising melee units. The second sub-skill, All In, deals up to 750% physical damage to 1 enemy unit every 4 rounds, but it causes the next instance of damage after this activation to be reduced by 50%. And finally, his Respect 5 tree opens with Lord of the Glittering Caves. This increases the damage dealt to enemy melee units by your army by up to 25% and reduces damage taken from enemy melee units by 5% when maximised. The top sub-skill is Break Defences, which per skill point deals 37.1% damage to 1 enemy unit, but also reduces their defense by 4.2%. This activates every other round. And the last sub-skill is Heavily Wounded, which activates every 4 rounds, the same as All In, and deals 70% damage per skill point to 1 enemy unit, whilst also stopping that unit from healing for the next 2 rounds. So with this, you'll notice that Gimli has an enormous number of commander damage skills. This means that as you increase his respect, his damage will just continue to climb and climb. So don't be afraid to get him to a really high respect level, as all you're going to do is just make his damage dealt go through the roof. This build will summarise the basic build, then I'll cover prioritisation and also where to put any additional skill points you have. So first up, I recommend maximising Gimli's first Respect 0 skill tree. We choose to do this because it gives massive passive buffs to Gimli's regular damage. Bonus normal attack damage from both Experienced Warrior and Collaboration makes Gimli more effective every single turn when he does his normal attack, whilst Hunt Down will also cause your targets to receive additional damage every time that buff stacks. And these are all passive skills, so do not activate on select turns, and so are always in effect. Next up, we want to maximise Gimli's Respect 3 skill tree. Whirlwind and All In deal massive amounts of skill damage, whilst Durin's Blood increases the amount of damage dealt by these skills by 35%. This means that every 3 or 4 turns, Gimli will inflict enormous amounts of skill damage on top of his already boosted normal attack damage. And lastly, we want to put 2 points into Lord of the Glittering Caves. This isn't because we want to boost our unit's damage, but allow us to put 1 point into both Break Defences and Heavily Wounded. Heavily Wounded, I recommend always keeping to 1 point unless you have skill points to burn and you've maximised all other damage skills first. We're not selecting this skill for the bonus 70% physical damage, though that is quite nice, but instead we're using it for the anti-healing to 1 opposing unit. This healing prevention is extremely useful against many meta commanders and gear which focus on maximising healing. As I said, we also have 1 point in Break Defences, just for that defence reduction, and any spare points that you have left on your Gimli should be allocated to Break Defences where possible, though of course you'll have to allocate some to Lord of the Glittering Caves to allow more points to be put into Break Defences. So Gimli is also one of the commanders in the game in which the order with which you allocate your skill points is important, as it can affect the order in which they activate in battle. For most users of Gimli, you should make sure to add skill points to All In before Heavily Wounded. This is because All In and Heavily Wounded activate on exactly the same turn, and All In reduces the next instance of damage by 50%. So you'd prefer this reduction to happen on the 70% physical damage being dealt by Heavily Wounded than, instead, if it activated afterwards, it would massively reduce the amount of damage being dealt by your normal attack, which of course is built up by that Experienced Warrior skill tree, so you'd lose a massive amount of damage from that normal attack. Instead, you can just do half of 70% damage. So it basically reduces the amount of damage that you lose from all in. However, if you have a considerable number of skill points and you've maximised Lord of Glittering Caves and Break Defences, you may have put additional points into Heavily Wounded. Once a second or third point is put here, then I'd recommend skilling all in after Heavily Wounded, so not to reduce this buff damage. Hopefully that makes sense. So, into the equipment. A lot of this will be very familiar to anyone who's watched my other commander guide for Aragorn 2, as again, we're just trying to maximise might and increase his damage dealt by as much as possible. So for a flawless weapon, what we're going to look to use is a battle axe with the flay effect. The reason we choose the battle axe is because it's the highest might item available in the flawless rarity. And the reason we choose flay is because it can basically mean that Gimli can ignore some of the opposing commander's army's defense so that he'll deal more damage to those units. For armor, we're going to look to use a scale mail with the gallant effect. So the scale mail grants Gimli a nice amount of additional might to again increase that damage, a little bit of focus to assist with keeping your troops alive, and in a similar vein, bonus defense for your army just to keep them alive so Gimli can deal as much damage as possible. The gallant effect also grants an additional 3 might per refinement, so just make sure that Gimli's might is as high as it possibly can be. For the helmet, we're also going to look to use a full helm with the melee vigour effect. Again, this is the maximum might that you can get from an item in the flawless rarity, so that's why we've chosen this. And the reason we want the melee vigour effect is it reduces damage dealt to your armies by up to 6% when fully refined, which will keep your troops alive, so Gimli can last all of the rounds, dealing as much damage as possible. And lastly, for an accessory, we're going to look to use the Hithlane. The reason we're using this is simply because it's the only purple rarity accessory or flawless accessory that grants might, and again, we're just trying to maximise this might as much as possible. The additional army HP, though, of course, is always nice to get to, again, help the survivability of your units. Into the legendary rarity, I could have put, for weapons, the Axe of Khazad-dûm, because that's the highest exquisite rarity weapon, or the highest might available on exquisite rarity weapon. However, I just cannot ignore that Gimli's unique item is just so good. So if you can, get him to rank 10 and get this item, as it just takes Gimli to a whole nother level. So that is definitely the most recommended item in this build. For legendary armour, we're going to look to use Durin's Plate on Gimli where possible. The reason for this is it grants an enormous might bonus, again just trying to maximise that might. It grants additional HP to our dwarves, improving their survivability, and just a tiny extra bonus is that it can improve their attack. This plate is particularly good if you have it with the dominance effect, which can increase his might by 5, or can also go all the way up to 30 additional might. So that, of course, is a huge buff, again, to Gimli's might, meaning he deals more damage. Though you can't really go wrong with either Fortitude of Dwarfs or Resilience of Soldiers either, which reduces the damage dealt to your units or buffs their defense. But of course, in my opinion, you should always be increasing that might. For the helm, we're going to look to use the Iron Bassinet. When fully strengthened, this can give a massive 42 additional might to Gimli, but also 30 defense to your dwarves, again making them massively tanky. And if you have the Fortitude of Soldiers effect on this, or the Fortitude of Dwarves effect when using dwarf units, which you should, you'll reduce the amount of damage received by your dwarf units by up to 9%, which can be huge. And lastly, for an accessory, there's actually 2 I would recommend here. One is the Box of Knowledge, but particularly focused for the warrior role, as any other Box of Knowledge will not activate for those who are unaware. But the warrior role, again, is very useful as it grants huge amounts of might, and if you read the effects, it massively buffs Gimli's commander damage as well. So again, that is probably the best accessory for him. But another good accessory, again, they're very different in the way they work, but both are probably equally effective with Gimli, is Erebor's Pride. Erebor's Pride is an accessory primarily focused around offering might. That's the only statistic it increases, on the commander anyway, but also grants up to a massive 6 HP to your dwarf units, again making them more tanky. For the buff on this, it doesn't really matter which one you go for. Personally, I quite like the Second Wind buff, which can remove a random debuff from your units on round 4 and also provide an amount of healing. Iron Guard is also useful for allowing your units to recover up to 36% HP every round. Personally, I wouldn't recommend Might of Dwarves, which I see chosen quite a lot, because it improves your dwarf ally units' damage dealt, but we're not trying to get damage dealt by the dwarfs, we're trying to deal damage using Gimli. As you can see, the primary goal with all of this equipment is just to increase the might as much as possible. We want Gimli doing as much damage as possible, whilst also meaning that his units take as little damage as possible. So whilst I understand a lot of you are not going to be able to fully strengthen and refine the legendary gear recommended, definitely just look to get as many things on him which increases might as much as possible. And then if you do that, you'll leave yourself with just a massive, massive damage dealer who can just cut through the battlefield at will. So now, into his recommended units. For Gimli, I only have 2 recommended army compositions. That's because with Gimli, you should always be using Dwarven units, because as I said with the gear earlier on, almost all of it buffs Dwarven units only. And both of these compositions are basically exactly the same. What you're going to want is you're going to want one of the Dwarven tank units. So if you're any good side faction, you want to use the Guardian unit and use as many of these as possible. So you can use just a complete single stack and send him like that. You do also have the option to send him in with perhaps some rams. So you could send him in with 800 rams just to reduce the opposing defense. And then if you do that, I'd also recommend chucking in just 1 stack of sentinels, just because they can take 1 extra instance of damage that might have hit one of your other units. And then if that happens, basically they will only lose 100 units, whereas if you hit your guardians, you might have lost many, many more. And the other recommended option is again just to use exactly the same, but with Iron Warriors if you're the Erebor faction. Iron Warriors are probably the best T4 in the game, massively tanky, so you definitely want to use these if you have them available. The only time, if you're Erebor, I would use Guardians over Iron Warriors is if when you're fighting evil factions, because the Alchemist bombs from the Witch King can deal a hell of a lot of burn damage, and Guardians have this burn damage reduction, but Iron Warriors do not. So now, into battle reports. The first one you see here is a Gimli from one of my fellowship mates, Landon. You can see here he has absolutely fantastic gear, a lot of the stuff that I recommended, particularly a fully strengthened and 2 times refined Barlin's axe. So he's getting an enormous amount of might and getting up to 12% additional bonus damage. And because his focus is over 100, he's also getting the pursuit. Not that that matters here against Khaldun, but he's also got a highly strengthened and refined Durin's Plate, Iron Bassinet, and Erebor's Pride, mostly with the recommended buffs, apart from Erebor's Pride. You can see with the skill build, he's set it up exactly as I said earlier on. His remaining skill points have gone into Lord of the Glittering Caves and also Break Defences. And you'll see he's actually 3 levels lower than the Khaldun he's facing. Khaldun obviously is much worse geared, so that will be part of it and definitely should be attributed in. But again, you see it's got all of these reductions here. So Khaldun normally would be a brilliant counter to Gimli, because so many of his skills just massively reduce that damage taken by his units, so should reduce the amount of damage being dealt by Gimli. But in the end, he's just way too overwhelming. You'll see that both commanders are using T4 units, and for the rest of it, he's gone for both Iron Warriors and Guardians with a little mix, and chucked in some Rams for good measure as well. And the Khaldun is using, as you'd expect, an all evil men build, apart from the Warlords, which is odd because of course they won't get the buffs that from Khaldun's evil men gear and skills, but still these are a very strong troop, so can be used to good effect with Khaldun. Khaldun's also 3 levels higher, so she has additional troops and additional skills. And still this Gimli absolutely wiped the floor with him, as you'll see here. If we look into the damage breakdown, you'll see that not only did the troops deal a good amount of damage, some of that's likely due to the accessory that Landon has on, buffing the attack of particularly the Iron Warriors, which would be very useful. But Gimli himself dealt an almost 230k of damage, which is absolutely enormous, and just absolutely wiped the enemy troops. So you'll see here, the amount of damage every unit took is just enormous, and it means that basically he just absolutely split them apart. So here is actually a report against good side as well, and a particularly good side commander as well in Gandalf the White, probably one of the best tier 3 commanders available. And this is my own Gimli coming up against him. You can see I've gone for the combination of Iron Warriors and Guardians, and also 700 Rams just to harm their defense. For equipment, you can see mine's nowhere near as good as Landon's is in the last report, but it's still reasonable. I've got the 1-star strengthened Balin's axe, looking to get that up in future. I've got scale mail with the melee vigor just to keep my units alive. And then I've actually gone for the mounted horseman helm. Reason for this is I knew a Gandalf the White was coming, so I wanted to make sure I had the stun immunity to counter the Gandalf. And of course, counters are one of the most important things in this game. And then finally for accessory, I've gone for the Hithlane, just for bonus HP and the might. And my build, as you can see, is pretty standard per my guide earlier on. The Gandalf the White equipment probably just about edges mine. Whilst it's not as strengthened as refined, it is legendary gear. In particular, this grey wizard's hat provides good bonuses to his mounted units and a lot of focus. And all of his gear generally just boosts his focus. You can see he's got a massive 426 focus. And as for his skill build, you can see it's pretty standard for Gandalf the White. Mainly focused around reducing my defense, debuffing my damage received, inflicting stuns, and mainly just dealing focus damage as well with that huge focus stat. So this is a pretty standard Gandalf the White. It is a couple of levels lower and missing maybe 100 odd troops, but you can see Gimli is just absolutely carved through him, taking his army out in one hit without even the draw of over 300k of damage. You can see that soldier damage here, our soldiers actually dealt almost the same amount of damage, which is quite surprising considering he is running Cavaliers, which are obviously primarily a DPS unit, whereas I'm running all tanks. But whilst soldier damage is very similar, you can see that Gimli's commander damage just far outweighed Gandalf's with 205 commander damage. So even with gear not as strong as in the last report, I'm still dealing over 200k of commander damage, which just shows how strong Gimli can be. And with that, that's going to be everything I've got to show you. I really hope you've enjoyed. If you have, please drop a like and please consider subscribing. And if you do, I really hope to see you on the next one.